So again, good afternoon, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Steve Handelman. I'm Director of the Center on Media, Crime, and Justice at John Jay College, and I want to welcome all of you to our two-day webinar on solitary confinement, unfinished business. As some of you may know, this is the second time we're doing a special program on solitary confinement. Our last one was in 2018. And that one, we said solitary confinement is on its way out. People are beginning to re-examine and take another look at it. And it was a good news seminar, a good news program for the journalists who were involved. And now, 4 years later, things seem to have been reversed slightly. I think the last percentage I saw was a 500% increase in solitary over the last years, and blaming in particular the pandemic. If you look at some of the material from our conference in 2018 and some of the conferences we've had earlier, you'll notice the change. With this time, we want to take a closer look at why we're still having this debate about solitary confinement, whether it's useful at all as a tool. Are there alternatives to it? And we wanted to get as much of an input from justice impacted people as well. So I'm going to be putting in the chat section some links, so you'll have them, first of all, for our agenda, the bios of our speakers, and additional links to some of the stories that we've been running over the course of the last couple of years. I think some of you may have seen the link to the 2018 conference. It's on our conference page, which I'll send a link to as well. But as soon as we have our second keynote speaker, who's Representative Trone, I think we can begin. Okay, and that reminds me, I should introduce Caddy Gray, who all of you know. She's the journalism coordinator. Caddy, put your picture on. There you go. Caddy, you want to say a few words about the theme and the modus operandi for the conference as well?
Sure. It's a pleasure having y'all here. Thank you, Dean Williams. I'm excited to hear you. Thank you, colleague journalist. I'm having some difficulty with the everyone chat function now, but throughout, as Steve said, we'll be putting resources in the chat. I'm also following up with a whole pool of resources that I've been collecting, research, some sort of story ideas and story prompts that may or may not be that arise as a part of this two-day discussion. But I'm your point person. I'm excited about this. This is both a story about corrections and it is a story about health. Most people come out of prison, so whatever are the impact or incarcerated people come home, they re-enter, and much of this discussion is about the impacts that they bring back into the community with them as part of their re-entry. So I'm excited that y'all are here, and I'm excited about this discussion.
Okay, I'm going to put on, first of all, the our agenda for the session. If you hang on 1 second, I'm just copying it in. Okay, there's our agenda for today's session and tomorrow's. Your link to today's session will also serve as your link for tomorrow's session as well. So I hope you can stay with us for the entire 2 days, and that goes for our guests and the members of the public as well. We have about 60 or 70 people who'll be cluing in, connecting today over the next 2 days. So welcome, everyone. While we're waiting for Representative Trone, maybe I'll start with Director Williams, if that's okay. We can do a quick, just a reversal of what we originally planned. You
Sure,
okay with that?
I'm very flexible here. Go right ahead.
Okay, thank you, Dean. So let me introduce, we're really pleased and honored to have Director Williams with us today. He is, as the agenda notes, he is the Executive Director of the Colorado Department of Corrections and has been since 2019. He was Commissioner of Corrections in Alaska before that, and that was a culmination of a long career, really, that included stints as a youth counselor and a reserve police officer as well. So he's been in every single part of the system. I will send a full list of our speakers' bios in a second. But let me start with Director Williams first. That we're talking about an issue that we thought was pretty much solved, but you guys in Colorado have solved it in the sense you've begun to reduce the use of solitary confinement. Can you tell us what the results have been and why you've done it?
Well, I mean, I want to give credit where credit is due on this. And by the way, thank you for having me. I'm an unlikely director in many ways. I retired from government a couple different times, and here I am. Retirement hasn't stuck. And mostly it's because I was convicted by what I saw, and I felt that I had an obligation to try to make things better where I could. And it's the journey to maybe being a director is a slightly unusual one in this field. So to answer your question, Tom Clements, who was in my position about 9 or 10 years ago, those of you in the country remember the story of Tom. Yes. Tom was a man in my position 9 or 10 years ago, was assassinated at his home north of headquarters in Colorado Springs and Monument. It was a national story. The bad guy killed a pizza delivery guy, showed up at Tom's door, assassinated him. Tom's entire mission, and Tom was a director. I wasn't even in the corrections system, the adult corrections system at that time. I ran juvenile facilities. I was a juvenile facility warden. I did diversion work, keeping kids out of the system from the school to prison pipeline. I developed an alternative school. And so I wasn't even in the adult corrections world when Tom was assassinated at his house. Tom's entire effort, and as a man ahead of his time, was really to go after the issue of solitary confinement. Tom was actually assassinated by the very individual that Tom was trying to help, of deep irony. So Tom started this journey as a correctional leader in the country ahead of his time to make an impact and reduce solitary confinement in Colorado. After his assassination, my predecessor, my friend Rick Ramish, took over, continued the journey, and I have maintained that in my almost 4 years of leadership here in Colorado. And so we have reduced solitary confinement to nearly zero, really zero, in terms of our policy. Now, I'll tell you this full caveat, right, is that the pandemic threw a lot of havoc at us in terms of short staffing. And so there's been a debate about, well, how are we being evaluated in the course of the pandemic? So I'm not going to say we adhered to all of our policies during the crisis of the pandemic, especially when we had large staff numbers out, et cetera, and we had it ripping through the department. But of course, I believe that solitary confinement, either elimination or drastic reduction, is the goal. I have to tell you that I've maintained that standard here in Colorado, and we can talk about some of the nuances of that and whether or not where are we at, and in fact, have we gone too far, and some of those discussions, those finer points.
Well, let me ask you, thank you, Dr. Lewis, but let me ask you, before I move over to Representative Trone, who I want to welcome to our session today. Why do you think, looking at your colleagues around the country, why have your colleagues found it so difficult, or rather the legislatures in their states have found it so difficult to follow Colorado?
Well, I want to be careful in analyzing my fellow colleagues' intentions or motivations, right? But I'll say this, and this gets into some of my other notes I wanted to talk about solitary confinement, which is the broader context of confinement in our country, right? And have we gotten
Right.
confinement right in general? Because I think there's a broader underpinning around solitary confinement, that we as a country have viewed prison as a place of punishment for a very, very long time. Yeah. And flowing from that has been the use of solitary confinement to control bad behavior, to control violence, et cetera. Well, it's exacerbated problems, if anything, worse. So, and keep in mind, there are systems that are still very understaffed, let alone, I mean, we're in a serious staffing crisis in Colorado. So I think there's a long historical aspect and view of solitary confinement. In the broader context, though, of how prison is viewed in general, right? We have viewed prison as the place of punishment. I think that's a backwards approach. I mean, this is what the European countries, and not just the European countries, but I'm not the only one director, right, who wants to eliminate or reduce solitary confinement. So I'll say this, I am not the only director yet that has views this as an important initiative. But there are long historical pressures around the use of solitary confinement that a person in my job has to. Now, I'll be clear with you. I benefited from the tip of the spear work that was done by Tom Clements and Rick Ramish. I've just been able to maintain that good work that was being done.
Mm-hmm.
The larger problem for me, I think, is the view of punishment overall, or the view of corrections overall. And humanizing, which has been the mission here in Colorado, and also among some of my colleagues, to do the same thing, reduces all kinds of other issues, and I would venture to say would also reduce the use of solitary confinement as we humanize the prison system to say, look, it has to be better results.
Right. So this is meant to be a scene-setting conversation. So you mentioned context, and so let's go back to that for a second. When we had our earlier conference in 2018, the country was in a much more hopeful mood. We were in a reform mood. Crime was down to one of its lowest levels in decades. The notion of reform, justice reform, in pretty much every area of the system appeared popular, was welcomed by legislators at both the state and federal levels. And we'd be remiss if we didn't acknowledge that 4 years later, the atmosphere has changed. And of course, the idea of solitary confinement and reform post-pandemic has fallen into that. And I wanted to pass the mic, so to speak, over to Representative Trone to ask him to evaluate what's been going on in the wake of that changed atmosphere. If you look at polls, we have a poll or a story in the crime report this morning, which points out that, despite the atmospherics, a large majority of Americans are still in favor of reforms all the way down the line, including alternatives to punishment, lower sentences. But yet we are talking about solitary confinement almost as if we had not spoken about the issue before, as if we're doing it for the first time. So by way of introduction, Representative Trone, as many of you know, is a Democrat from Maryland. He serves on the House Appropriations and Veterans Affairs committees and the Joint Economic Committee. And he has sponsored a very important bill to reduce federal solitary confinement in the federal system. So Representative Trone, over to you. How has the context changed and prevented us from going further?
Well, I'll tell you what, I had put together some prepared remarks, which I'd like to roll through quickly, and then I'm happy to answer any questions, Steve. And I couldn't agree more with the comments by Dean. I mean, we've really just failed to progress, and there's no reason for this atrocity to continue. But so thank you guys for having us here. And I also want to put a call out for Teresa Gregg of the ACLU, their prison project on solitary confinement. They helped us so much, the ACLU, craft this legislation that we put together. Before I came to Congress, I spent 37 years in business. I'm self-employed. I founded a company called Total Wine and More. I've got 12,000 employees in 27 states, but 500 of those employees are justice impacted. So we can see if we eliminate banning the box, which I have legislation for that, hire returning citizens, we can chip away at this situation, because the number one thing is a job. If we can get folks a job, the recidivism rates drop like a rock. So we're looking forward to working with Colette Peters, the new head of BOP. We've already got our team setting up a meeting with her. We had tried to work with the previous head of BOP. He was not capable of getting done. I recommended, as did Senator Durbin, he be fired. Eventually he was fired, and now we're going to start anew. And we're going to put together what we call an opportunity pipeline, which is a piece of a change in the structure where we have large employers, big companies, FedEx, UPS, Target, Walmart, actually hiring returning citizens before they leave, doing the job training while they're incarcerated, hard skills, soft skills. And then the plan is to bring them out right away into a job anywhere in the 50 states, because we have to have super large employers that have hundreds of thousands of jobs all over the country in every venue. So that's down the road. That's not on today's point, but I wanted to plant that seed with you because that's something we've been heavily involved in the last 2 years. And now we're looking forward to working with a new BOP administrator. You know, we've been working alongside the ACLU forever. You know, my background, why I'm involved in this is I was arrested 3 times early in my business career by a corrupt attorney general in Pennsylvania. He was later found to be violated a number of crimes and was arrested himself and imprisoned. But I was successful and vindicated myself. And I often talk about it because I had education, good legal team. I could have the money to buy, employ good legal support, and I'm white. Those 3 benefits, I think, let me succeed and come out clean on all 3 of the charges against me, and be able to stand firm and not accept the plea bargain, not accept the bad deal that would have tainted and ruined my life, and instead grow a $5-6 billion business, and now serve in the U.S. Congress. So from that experience, I formed the Trone Center for Justice and Equality at the ACLU, and that's where Tammy Gregg works, and that's where all the criminal justice work at the ACLU comes through our center there. So, which has led, we have to focus on the treatment of prisoners and this policy of over-incarceration, which has led the U.S. to imprison more people than any other country in the world. And that's a record we're not proud of. We can't be proud of. So now, as a member of Congress, criminal justice reform is one of our top priorities. Today, we're here to talk about one of the worst parts of that, solitary confinement. Study after study has shown over a course of a year, 20% of people are incarcerated in our state and federal prisons, put in solitary confinement at some point, often in cells smaller than a parking space. It's clear that it's inhumane, unjust in the short term, but also it's incredibly destructive to our society's long-term success. So we think about it, and the first point would be, unsurprisingly, those in solitary confinement much more likely to develop anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation, psychosis, leading to a whole risk of mental problems, but also physical conditions, including fractures, vision loss, chronic pain. The confinement does that. It's a huge toll already on our overstretched healthcare system. And as Dean mentioned, our overstretched prisons and jail system. Second point is that individuals who experience solitary confinement are roughly 15% more likely to recidivate. We've already got a 50 to 60% recidivism rate on previously incarcerated individuals. So we've got more incarcerated individuals in America per capita than any other country in the world. Any other country in the world. So shame on us for that. Let's imagine what we could do with that $81 billion a year we spend on our prison system. All the good stuff we could do in education, et cetera. And the incalculable benefit to these individuals' families and their own lives. Third point would be it's been argued that solitary confinement increases the safety of individuals and the correction staff. Dean can certainly address that. The numbers don't support it. In fact, VERA, Institute of Justice, found incarcerated people are frequently sent to solitary in response to low-level, nonviolent misbehaviors, or prison staff misinterprets what's a mental illness as an act of defiance or rule breaking. Further evidence shows that a decrease in solitary confinement does not increase the rate of violence in our prisons. So it begs the question, how come we can't end this? So we put together in June a bipartisan bill called the Solitary Confinement Study and Reform Act. Republican and Democrat, what it will do is create a commission focused on studying the effects of solitary confinement in our prison system, establish standards for reducing the use of solitary, and then states that comply will be eligible to receive additional money for community mental health funding. Mental health is what we're missing. We've got to fix that in our prisons, along with MAT and the addiction issues and the wraparound services. So that's not all we're working. The last thing I want to mention quickly is we're sending a letter today with Senator Durbin, who's been a fantastic ally on this, to the new Bureau of Prisons Director, urging her to take immediate action to reduce the use of solitary, as was directed by President Biden in his 522 executive order, and federal facilities. And for the individuals currently experiencing solitary confinement, we just can't wait. So criminal justice reform can, and it should be bipartisan. Working together, we can ensure our system is more fair and centers on the whole key is success after you leave. How we get folks to succeed after they leave so we don't recidivate. So thanks for being here. I'm happy to take any questions.
So thank you, Representative Trone. I think what's clear is that, as perhaps it wasn't as clear when we did this 4 years ago, that it's pretty hard to talk about solitary confinement unless you connect it to the state of the correction system in general. The two are inextricably intertwined, in a perhaps what we might say is a pathological way. But I want to go back to my opening remarks, which is that something has changed in the last 4 years when there was a lot more acceptance of the idea that solitary confinement, along with other parts of the correction system, need to change. There was certainly some movement during the pandemic that we need to change things. But over the last year, perhaps, for other reasons, for the political polarization of our country, reform is now almost a dirty word among the politicians of the country, among legislators, not necessarily among the public. So I wanted to ask you first, Representative Trone, what accounts for that? And does it make it that much harder to convince people that we need to change first solitary confinement as a tool in our correction system, and perhaps larger any kind of reform in the correction system in general?
I think the COVID really changed our country in a lot of ways that we won't really be readily apparent for a decade. And I talked to a school superintendent the other day, and she believes it'll be over 10 years before our children be able to deal with the grips of this. The idea you could go to school and get sick and die.
Right.
The idea you have to wear this mask. And, we saw that in the Great Resignation, in the business world where, turnover exceeded 20-25%, unheard of numbers as people looked introspectively and reevaluated their lives. And sometimes I think took a more softer, compassionate approach toward each other as they saw, a million of our fellow citizens, die right in front of us in quick order. So I think there has been a softening of the population that, we have to develop more empathy and, compassion and empathy of what this country, really, really needs. And so I think solitary confinement is part of that. They can see how cruel and inhumane, just clear as day, this is. And they've been home alone at COVID, and they knew how different it was to be alone, in your house with a computer. And now they think about folks incarcerated in a parking stall, alone. But I think in the legislature, we're getting a little bit of traction on certain parts of the other party, even though the atmosphere is so toxic. But, there's some folks like Congresswoman Bice of Arizona, Oklahoma, who was my Republican lead on this, and she sees this as rightly so for what it is, and that it's not fixing a problem. And if it's not fixing a problem and it's hurting people short-term, society long-term, we got to make a change, or shame on us.
So, I mean, during the pandemic, solitary administrative segregation was seen as a tool to deal with the danger of contagion itself. I think the figures say that as many as 300,000 people were held in administrative segregation around the country during the years of the pandemic, and that was pretty much of a 500% increase over the years before that. And I just want to go back to Director Williams for a moment here. That obviously that danger wasn't felt to the same extent in Colorado. I mean, has the pandemic still influenced and dealing with the post-pandemic era influenced how you and other authorities in Colorado feel about using solitary as an administrative tool, as a, if I can call it, a public health tool, almost to quarantine people where they wouldn't need to be quarantined otherwise?
Well, there's a couple big issues here, Ron. Prisons were never designed, and the level of incarceration and the massive amounts of incarceration we do in this country. You throw a pandemic into prisons that were never designed to handle that. And so the only tool left to myself and a bunch of other directors was to isolate people further, which was psychologically very damaging, disturbing, but we made very difficult decisions to not move people. We sheltered in place. We avoided some of the tragedies of the deaths by not moving people at all under any circumstances, because the disaster of what has happened in other states, and my colleagues and I learning that as we were all learning the sort of virulent nature and the aspects of asymptomology and all the things that made it difficult to keep it from spreading, let alone if you were careless and you weren't following it. So isolation, i.e. solitary confinement, and again, I'm very proud of what Colorado has done and what we've done, but during the pandemic, we used every available tool in terms of isolation. Am I proud about it? Of course I'm not. But the reality is that the priority around the time was to save lives. Here's what I think is the more profound issue about why now it's going to be, why it's harder in some ways to address the issue of solitary confinement.
So let me follow it up with a question from Salvador Rodriguez, one of our journalist fellows today. And by the way, I should add that if you have questions, please post them in the Q&A window, and we will get to them and have our speakers answer them in order. But from Salvador, he's asking you, Mr. Williams, under what, if any, conditions are people single-celled in Colorado prisons? And in the case, particularly of disciplinary issues, what does Colorado do that's different from the average state instead of just relying on solitary?
Well, there's several reasons. I said the hard work was done by my predecessor and his predecessor, Tom Clements, who was assassinated in my job, around one, just changing from isolation in a cell to restrainment at tables, right? We bring people out. We avoid solitary confinement. What's the remedy? Like, what are we doing differently? It's not exactly totally fancy, to be quite frank. It's not the most, this is so humane in comparison to solitary. We bring people out who have had a long history of violence. They are restrained at tables. We allow them to play cards. We allow them to interact with each other. And then we try to continue to progress them and move them even out of that further restriction to try to get them back into more general population. So what we're doing in the alternative is it, do I go and say, wow, this is so amazing? No, I don't. It is better than solitary. But I would say there's a larger context. And before Representative Trone, before you got on, I tried to sort of underpin this discussion in sort of two ways. One, yes, a pandemic happened, which caused a heightened death behind the walls because of a virus before we had vaccines available. That caused a very tightening of movement around people and exacerbated isolation in the prison system. Prisons have no chance. I could watch, we would develop maps and watch how the virus would spread through prison cells. We have some of the old open bar, I call them the old Shawshank Redemption prisons, which I just hate. But the reality is I could watch from week to week how it was spreading through the entire population of 300, right? And how it would move. And so in some ways, it really almost didn't matter, but we were doing everything we could to avoid the big surge of the pandemic, which caused exacerbated, because you couldn't get to people. People were dying because, you know, we were losing them in the corners, if you will. The biggest issue facing us now, and why it's difficult now, is the severe staffing crisis that the entire state system, including the Bureau of Prisons. And by the way, Representative Trone, I know the new board, the BOP director. I think at the world of her, she has a fantastic reputation. It was the right choice there, you know, and I count her as a friend, and she's a very forward-thinking person. But the limitations that are on these systems with the levels of incarceration we have, and now the staff shortages we have, has now exacerbated this issue. So I agree. And so I'm going to say something that some of you will agree with, and maybe some of you won't. The actual particular issue of solitary confinement is an important one. Do not misunderstand me. And how you develop policies so you're not putting people in solitary confinement for minor misbehaviors or talking back or doing or protective custody. Look at protective custody issues. People get into protective custody position, they stay in for years, and they devolve, and and they're asking to stay in. I mean, it's a horrible situation, right? So don't get me wrong. I believe that issue in itself, and developing policies that slow that down and have more frequent reviews, and getting away from protective custody that requires isolation or solitary confinement. All those things Colorado did, we're doing, not perfectly, and other state leaders, and I know the BOP director is interested in this. And so, but the biggest exacerbation of all the problems now is this severe staffing crisis. Right. And it's because we have so many people in prison, quite frank. So
we saw that in the report.
Don't underestimate the power of continuing to look at diversion and reducing prison populations. If you want to address solitary confinement, there are these other factors that are really going to influence whether or not we can successfully get away from solitary confinement as a standard sort of tool in the corrections world.
Right. It's one of the takeaways. So, Kathy, did you have something you wanted to?
Yeah, actually, Director Williams, and I, because I was dealing with some tech side issues, I hope you didn't address this, but when we had our initial discussion, you had mentioned programming, changes in prison uniforms, programs that allow prisoners more responsibility to keep them from the kind of behavior. If you would address what y'all are doing in those rudimentary ways to lessen the chances that someone behaves in a way that ends in solitary, and if you can cite other jurisdictions that are doing similar things, I think that would be really helpful.
Oh, I'm not the only one doing this, but I'll tell you, the humanization, or what the Norwegians call the normalizations of prisons, is probably one of the most important dynamic changes in terms of changing prison culture and reducing solitary confinement. I was just in a unit yesterday, on a dementia unit. I had offender care aides, we call them. I hate this term offender, but we're one of the states that hasn't dumped it yet. Other states have, by the way. The former Bureau of Prisons, the prisons director, BOP director, her state dumped these unhelpful titles like offender or convict, and so. But we have changed prison culture by empowering men and women in our custody to take ownership and responsibility. That's why we do theater. That's why we have a podcast. That's why we're the first state in the country, by the way, take note, that has a radio station produced on the inside that's broadcast on the outside. We have mentors. We have an entire mentoring aspect of men mentoring. So I was in this dementia unit where 14 men are taking care of 14 other men who have dementia. And And you know what they wanted? What they wanted more responsibility. They wanted more training to help these men with dementia. These are other men taking care of these other men. And so this is the larger context of what's been wrong, and how you reduce solitary confinement is change prison culture, reduce the us versus them, find ways and opportunities. And I think it's through many different flavors, right? All those things that we also do theater shows. We have honor units that are led by men and women. No staff are on the units. They lead themselves. I just visited also women's prison yesterday. They're wearing their own clothes. They're wearing t-shirts and polo shirts and jeans. This is radical stuff. Not everywhere in the prison, but you have to start somewhere. And you know what happens? What happens is that men and women rise up to whatever level. It's like raising children and giving them a little more response. Do you want this more than what we want it? You have to want it more than what we want it. And guess what they do? That does not come overnight. That does not come overnight. That does not come, but you have to start somewhere. So I've now a little over 7 years in this job, 4 years here, almost 3 years in Alaska, running Alaska. And the biggest change I have seen is in making prisons more humane and reducing solitary confinement, reducing violence and all the things we don't want, right? Is finding ways to humanize the system to give men and women purpose and
So
giving hope.
let me, if I can, let me go back to Representative Trone for a moment and ask him, tell us a little bit more about his bill, or the combined bill, and how that will, you hope, impact the prison culture or change the prison culture that Director Williams has been talking about.
I think Director Williams hit upon something. I'd rather touch on that first, if you don't mind, in that we've got to stop feeding the beast. The beast has got, millions of folks there. And a problem within the beast is solitary confinement. We got it. And we got to address that. But we can't just keep sending, 1 in 3 young Black Americans into incarceration. It's unacceptable. It's unimaginable. So it's a lot of little things. It's a lot of treating addiction like the disease that it is, not a crime. Those folks have to end up in addiction assistance areas and not in jail. How we deal with mental health, that's often overlapping and leading people into jail. But most importantly is once folks are out of jail, we got to keep them out. When our recidivism rates are so high, that's what's driving the beast. It's just a lifelong circle of prison to prison, culture. And we've got 2 bills about that, both of which just passed the House last week. A bill I wrote called the Fresh Start Act, and a bill Lisa Blunt Rochester of Delaware wrote called the Clean Slate Act. And both of those bills in the Senate now, and when folks have their record cleaned, they've served their time, they've paid the price. What's happening is states aren't cleaning the records off. 8% of records are cleaned off. States like Texas and Florida never clean off the record. So when an employer looks at their record, it shows they committed the crime. It's not been expunged off, cleaned off the record. So what these bills are to do is to put technology and federal money to incentivize the states to do the job they should be doing, but they seem to have little desire to do it. And that's clean off those records. So businesses like myself can hire them. Now, police still have visibility. So all the police police groups were good with these bills. They have visibility, business does not. So it's about creating jobs, clearing the records. We talked about earlier the opportunity pipeline, how important that is, and other courts, diversionary courts, all kinds of drug courts, vets courts, those type of things to stop the flow inside. And then as I mentioned earlier, our bill is going to study it, get best practices, and then give states to incentivize and do those best practices with the carrot of mental health money, which I was in a prison the other day and they had like 1,300 inmates and 1 mental health professional. 1. Getting MAT and the medically assisted treatment bill, we're going to get that X waiver dropped. That bill's out of the House. It's in the Senate. We'll pass it after the recess. And we've got to get MAT all over the prisons because that's a set of drugs that can really help folks, recover and take away the cravings, for the narcotics, which are often, as Dean can talk about, still rife within the system itself.
Is there bipartisan appetite for doing that?
That group of bills called Restoring Hope Bill, we passed the House 402 to 20. Only the 20 nuts on the Freedom Caucus voted against it. Everybody else voted yes. So that's pretty good appetite. And I think we'll get 60 votes in the Senate. It's just good. It's good government. And a lot of mental health bills in there and a lot of addiction bills in there. So that group is going to come through. It'll be harder to get our clean slate than Fresh Start Act, but we're out of the House. It was bipartisan, and now we're in the Senate.
I have a couple of questions here that are interesting. One, I think is directed to Dean Williams from Mr. Johnson, who asked whether most of your staff officers, your correction officers, are on board with your emphasis on reducing solitary confinement. Do they need a lot of persuasion?
Well, I think we are now because we've been down the road a bit. I'll say this, there are certain individuals, again, don't discount where I'm at and who I am, but there are certain individuals, a very small number of individuals that are so violent, that are so bad that if I had to do what Colorado is doing all over again in hindsight, I would leave a small sliver open, because some of those individuals have assaulted staff in very serious ways. And I'm not I guess I'm a proponent of allowing exceptional cases to have exceptional responses that must be graduated up, must be cleared up, must be reviewed regularly. But there are exceptional cases in the prison system, and where we lose people, can I drop something in to tell you that, well, if you're a zero tolerance, we should never have any response to like that. You'll lose people along the way. There are exceptional cases. They're in Colorado, right? There's probably 25 individuals that I would sign off on, 20 individuals that I would sign off on to say, you know what, they're just gone. We're going to have to leave them in 23 hours a day. To hear me, that is not the standard of what it should be for 99.9% of the rest of the population, 99.5% of the population. We lose people, though, when we don't understand that some of these individuals are so far gone and so far away from us that they are extremely dangerous, right? The problem is that when we open the door on solitary confinement, we have all the other things that go through it. People who were talking back to staff, we put in solitary, minor infractions, we put into we've way overused it, but there is a certain percentage. I said this is sort of our prep talk, right? That like I said, there's 20, 25 individuals I probably would sign off on. I think I'm one of the most forward-thinking directors in the nation, next to my colleague, the BOP director, right? But we lose staff when we ignore these exceptionally dangerous individuals. And so as you're making this argument for solitary confinement, which I am on your side, I'm with you, right? It's been overused. Colorado has done a great job of drawing it back and to convince other states that, hey, let's get smarter policies, right? So I would just say that as the caveat, that there might be exceptional cases. Corrections have to be able to respond to exceptional cases, or you lose staff goodwill very quickly. And so that is the one caveat I'd make on how you can continue to bring staff along.
It may be a bit too early. This is a question from Jenny Sorensen, and it may be a bit too early to get an answer on this, but she's wondering, if there's any empirical literature or research that can track the impact so far of the reduction of solitary in Colorado?
Well, there's not. I mean, we look at violence throughout, and this would happen more with my predecessor, but we did not see a spike or an increase in violence as a result of solitary confinement reduction. And so there's a lot of work that's done around that. I would say the converse of keeping people in solitary confinement, my predecessor talked a lot about this in his history, like Colorado was releasing, like a lot of states, releasing people straight from solitary confinement on the street, right? What kind of practice is this? I mean, we can't even control them in prison to put them in solitary, then they were released straight out on the street. So we know that smart policies, if it's done wisely, other states have done this too. North Dakota, conservative states have done this in attempts to slow down, reduce their solitary confinement, have less reliance upon it. If it's done strategically and where you can move the staff with you, you'll have better results. There are some states where they have enacted this rather quickly. They've had violent spikes as a result of it, et cetera. I mean, it may be related to that. I would encourage strategic approaches in change management for states that are going through this. I wouldn't say just adopt everything that Colorado did, but I have to say, I think we're still sort of the light on the hill in terms of what you can do for a dramatic reduction. And I have maintained that. I said the only change I would make is I'd probably give myself a very small, slim opportunity for 20 or 25 individuals that we can't really reach under any circumstances, in spite of everyone's best efforts.
So the takeaway I'm getting from both of you gentlemen is that really the movement to abolish solitary or reduce solitary has run head on into the problems of changing the prison system, changing the prison culture. So I'd like you to take a little bit more time, maybe talking about how reforming solitary can actually fit inside the larger goal of making those big reforms to the correction system. Representative Trone, you started talking a little bit about that, and you did say that there's some bipartisan support for the idea. I have to be a little bit skeptical about that, about the support part of it, because although there has been a lot of support a couple of years ago for that, the atmospherics right now are anything but. So you're going, it seems to me, a little bit more uphill than you might have been 3 or 4 years ago.
I think we're clearly uphill, but what we see is, I think, more compassion and some group of legislators outside the hardcore right looking to say, where can we work together? And we've put together a group on mental health and addiction, 140 members, called the Bipartisan Mental Health Addiction Task Force, which I'm co-chair. And we got 106 bills out of that, 100% bipartisan, everyone. 20 some through the House, 7 are law, probably another 10 are going to become law. So I think there's ways we have had connectivity, but the press only wants to talk about the nuts, the insanity, the incendiary comments that are thrown out. So, you know, my mission is work below the TV line and build connectivity with like members that just feel compassion for those that have been so left out, and no one more than the prison system.
So we have the press here with us, and maybe the most enlightened members of the press, but this is a conference to help journalists cover this issue better. So I'd like to ask you first, maybe Representative Trone and then Dean Williams, what could the press do, what could it cover that it's not covering now about this issue of solitary and about the general challenge of corrections reform?
At a top line, I think the press has to point out that, you know, we have 25% of the world's prisoners, and we're 4.3% of the world's population. So those per capita numbers are staggering. You know, what kind of a country and prisons that percentage of our population? I mean, it's fundamentally starts with education. It's systemically racist. There's no question about that. But at the end of the day, the press is going to talk about $81 billion. To get bipartisan support, the other side, the Republican side of the aisle, needs to agree with the fact that $81 billion a year locking people up, we could figure out a way to pay that forward into education. And we're short on workers right now. Every job we have worker, we have 2 job openings, 3.7% unemployment. So this is a tremendous source of holding the economy back. Workers that have, my company's got a 14% better retention rate from the folks that we hired that are returning citizens because they got a second chance. And we should talk about in the press that America ought to be a country of compassion. We ought to be a country of civility, to work across the line. And this name calling is absolutely getting us nowhere, nowhere, nowhere. And we've got to believe in second chances. And these folks, through no fault of their own, fell in and made mistakes, often at a very young age, and they've paid the price. Now, what do we do to keep them to have a second chance in life? That's incumbent on us. And the press should challenge lawmakers to step up and come up with ideas to actually help those that have been lost in the shadows. And that's where these folks are, lost in the shadows, often with addiction issues, often with mental health issues, and then criminal justice issues, all three together.
So Dean, over to you. What have you been doing and your department been doing to bring the press over to your side in Colorado? I mean, have you given them more access, more openings?
This has been a mission since I got this job, and even in the old job. I mean, there's a lot of things that are covered and wrong in the system, and most of us know what that is. And I'm not saying you should not report on what the things are wrong if you're listening to media on this. Yes, there are a lot of things wrong, and a lot of things happen wrong in terms of the pandemic. I would just say this: one, understand prisons were never meant to cover a pandemic. When you have the levels and the high rates of incarceration we have, and now we have short staffing, right? People in my job wake up and go to bed with what the problems are every day. What would we like for you to cover more? I have worked on this, and I have gotten people to say, hey, you know, this humanizing of prisons is not only the moral and right thing to do. Guess what? You get better results too. It actually works. If we did re-entry more strategically, guess what? That works too. But let's forget re-entry. If we just did prisons right, humane, purpose-driven, real due process, credit for being on a different track. I just talked to my parole board leadership yesterday. I had them in the prison talking to the ladies and the men who were zooming in around the state. I had them at the women's prison. I had them go visit the unit where the women are living and have them talk about leadership and why men and women with purpose behind the walls make better neighbors to us. So if you can reduce, you care about the recidivism. Colorado's had a horrible recidivism rate. And my old state, Alaska, was one of the worst in the country, by the way.
Yes.
One of the fundamental problems is that punishing people when they come to prison doesn't work. It doesn't make us safer. And I would also argue, of course, that even longer prison sentences and more people, as Representative Trone talks about, if that was the remedy, we'd be the safest nation in the world. And
so we have
longer sentences, you know, would make us obviously safe. Yeah, so there are ways, there are things that work. There are things that work, and I'm not the only one. North Dakota, Connecticut, Oregon, where the BOP director came from. There are many of us who are doing it differently. And sometimes it maybe doesn't seem as sexy to you to cover those articles, but please consider it, because the country needs to understand that prison can be much better than historically it has been.
So we have about 5 minutes left before we do the close, but there's a very good question from a more complicated question, probably to ask within 5 minutes, from Clark Merrifield, which is about the economic considerations that we should think about in terms of solitary confinement. And you answered a little bit of his question, whether it's directly cheaper or more expensive to keep someone in solitary than it is in the general population. And then he adds, in terms of lost wages, productivity, once someone has experienced solitary and is released, they'll then have a harder time finding gainful employment coming back. We're going to be looking at those issues in more granular detail during the next 2 days, but I wonder if either of you wants to take a look at the economic dimensions of A, solitary confinement, and B, general prison reform. We've really got about 5 minutes left, so if you could take 2 minutes for making your closing arguments, that would be fantastic.
Go ahead, Dean.
Representative Trone.
You know the math on it.
Well, Representative Trone, let me say this. I don't think I know the math. You have a lot of smart people probably in this room, because I've heard this question a dozen times asked, well, does it cost more money to keep people in solitary confinement, or does it really cost less money? I don't know how you sort out whether or not it's more expensive or less expensive. Here's what we do know, though, right? We do know it does severely more damage, right? We do know it's profoundly traumatizing. It makes the chance of quote unquote rehabilitation or reentry so much more difficult. It actually exacerbates us versus them. It makes the situation more dangerous for our staff, not less dangerous for our staff. There's all kinds of other reasons. The economics behind it, I think, from Dean's humble opinion, we get too tied up a little bit, maybe in considering about, well, what's it cost more money to run these places? Because I could argue on both sides of that issue. So I would just say the real damage, the real cost is what happens to the human condition. And wherever we can mitigate the harshness of prison, which is by its fundamental nature, right, is already hard, where we can mitigate any further damage that's being done, that is the human capital and human cost and financial cost that you're actually you're gaining on if you can just reduce the damage once someone comes to prison, so they're not profoundly worse than when they leave.
I'm reminded in our first conference in 2018, we held it on the John Jay College campus, and some people actually set up a model solitary cell and asked people to come and experience it. And even experiencing it for 5 minutes for someone who's never done it before was enough to make you think and realize, you know, what solitary really means in human terms and in mental terms. Obviously, we can't do it this year, this time, because we're still in virtual mode. But Representative Trone, I'll give you maybe the last word if you'd like, just to wrap up. Let's move on to the next part of the conference.
No, Steve, Dean, thanks for having us here today, and thanks for driving this issue because it's so crucial. And we're not going to get it one day. We're going to get it over the course of years. We're going to build a coalition in Congress, and if I can build that bipartisan coalition, and sometimes it's working on other issues that give you credibility on this issue, because they know you're out there to do things for the right reasons, and that's what we're there for. Frankly, it's the only reason we're there in this job. But it can start with us. You know, in Maryland, 2018, 75% of folks in Maryland in our state prisons experienced solitary. The average stay was 45 days. Now that's pathetic. That's unbelievable. So progress, change, that starts with us. So we have a new governor, I believe, shortly coming in. I'm confident Wes Moore is going to be our next governor. He's a very, very good man, a guy that's going to, you know, I'm going to be able to sit down with and talk with and speak to about this issue and how we can do that in Maryland and try and get up where Oregon and Colorado have been. But also we've got to pay our people better that work in the prison. When we have this shortage of workers, it's because our pay isn't any good. I'm a businessman for 37 years. If you can't find team members, your pay, your benefits, your conditions are not good enough. So we've got to get governors in our state prisons where everybody is housed to improve that pay level so we have a better attitude, not mandatory overtime. When our men and women work mandatory overtime, they do nothing but resent it because you can't go home. They're 8 hours and they have to work another 8 hours. That's insanity. I've been in all my prisons. It's a #1 issue, the workforce issue. It starts with money. So I'm going to work with my governor, and we should all work with all of our governors to pay our people so we don't have this shortage of workers. And then after that, the last thing is first day of prison. From there on, it should be about success when you're released. Everything should be driven about your success to never return when you're released. And that's the things that Dean hit on. And I'm in total concurrence with every single thing he said.
That's a really good positive note to end on. I want to thank you both for taking the time to join us, and your comments have been fantastic. I wish we had more time, and I hope if you can to stay with us for today for other panels. Our next panel is going to be a continuation really in ways of discussion right now, which is the politics of solitary. So we're going to take a 5-minute or 10-minute break and then resume again. But once again, to both of you gentlemen, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Take care.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Dean.